Thank you for joining us today. My name is Michelle Wimes, and I'm the Chief Diversity and Professional Development Officer for Ogletree Deacons. We are one of the nation's largest labor and employment firms. We have over 53 offices in the U.S., Caribbean, Latin America, and Europe. And I am a former practicing attorney. I like to call myself a recovering attorney. I practiced for about 14 years in the area of labor and employment, and most recently was a partner in a firm. I am joined today by Dr. Rebecca Baumgardner, and she is the Senior D&I Manager at Ogletree Deacons, and she is a Certified Diversity Executive, having recently obtained her Diversity and Inclusion Certificate and has over 10 years experience in HR management in a variety of industries. And we are so pleased today to be able to lead this discussion on engaging hearts and minds and leading in the midst of a crisis and a racial pandemic. This is part of a webinar series that is hosted by Strife Shaw as part of the Belonging Project, which is a national initiative that consists of a collaborative among law firms, legal departments, bar associations, and national affinity group organizations to support diverse law students and lawyers during this pandemic. So we are happy to be here today. We want this to be interactive, and we are willing to take questions in the end. So to the extent that you have a question, please go ahead and write it in the chat, and we will get to those questions maybe throughout, but for certain in the end. So let's start with some of the changes that can upend the workplace. There are so many changes out there, and we're going to start with racial strife being one of them. And I tell you, in the United States, we are in a state of crisis, and the last few weeks have been exhausting, terrifying. They have been anxiety-ridden, especially for us Black employees. While we, watched on national TV, George Floyd, a Black man, die, just in front of everyone as a white officer used his knee in a chokehold to take away his last breath, basically. And then we learned that a Tacoma, Washington man, Manuel Ellis, literally had the same thing happen to him 2 months prior to George Floyd. It just didn't get a lot of press, and so we're just now kind of hearing about that. And then in addition to Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, we now have recently learned about Rayshard Brooks, who was an African-American man who was killed at Wendy's in a drive-through just last week. So we are in the middle of a racial pandemic, and it is upending and impacting our workplaces and our workforce. In addition to that, all of that is happening in the midst of a global health pandemic, which, of course, everyone knows is called COVID-19. And this outbreak, of course, is unprecedented. I mean, it's causing, in and of itself, a lot of stress and anxiety, and now we're in the process of trying to figure out how everybody gets back to work and returning to work in staggered, at least at Ogletree, we're doing it in a staggered way, and so there's stress around that as well. And then, of course, we've had severe economic downturns, and the whole purpose of this Belonging Project is to make sure that what happened in the 08-09 recession doesn't happen again during COVID-19, because we know during 08-09, there were over 10,000 jobs that were lost, and African-American and brown lawyers, Hispanic lawyers, were disproportionately impacted during that economic recession. And then when you think about some of the industry disruptions that have happened as well, we've seen a lot of industry disruptions, everything from, Blockbuster being replaced by Netflix. We've seen Uber and Lyft come in and kind of upend the travel industry with taxi cabs. We've seen Amazon kind of replace some of our mom and pop stores. I know my neighborhood has been impacted by that particularly. And then when you look at technology, I mean, I think about the fact that I was in law school 25 years ago, and man, nobody had personal laptop computers. I didn't have a personal laptop computer. Google didn't exist. We didn't have Facebook. There was no Snapchat, no Instagram, none of these things that kind of make our lives easier, Zoom, Skype. all of these things that we've actually been utilizing during COVID-19. And then I think about the fact that our phones are now taking photos, and you think about the impact of those photos and how they have helped us to document the racial brutality by policemen all across the country, and we actually need that technology. And then you look at the incidence of terrorism. We certainly have had natural disasters like Hurricane Katrina, which, upended New Orleans and displaced quite a few folks there. And then you couple that with some of the domestic terrorism that we've had. We've had things like, the Pulse nightclub shooting that happened in 2016, the Charlottesville shooting that happened in 2015, and then in 2017, we had the shooting in Vegas, which was one of the deadliest mass shootings by an individual in U.S. history. So a lot of those things are happening, and our employees are bringing that type of strife and anxiety into the workplace. We have offices where every single one of those things happened, not necessarily in Charlottesville, but close by. And so you also think about the natural disasters that are happening, everything from locusts in Kenya to bushfires in Australia, floods in Indonesia. I mean, there just have been so many things happening that also can impact the workplace. And one of the things that we do know is that there is this thing called post-traumatic growth. And that's been documented by researchers as this general concept that adversity and trauma can actually lead to positive change. It can lead to inducing individuals and organizations to fundamentally restructure how they do work, how they perceive themselves, how they perceive their organizations, and get to a point where we are bringing overall well-being and fulfillment to the workplace. But none of this starts with the people who are on the ground working every day. It really starts with leaders and managers. And so I want to talk a little bit about why we chose today to focus on leaders and managers. And that is because, leaders are the folks, our culture starts with leaders, and the leaders are the ones who are setting the tone in our organization. They are driving the values. Those values that we see determine the behaviors that we see exhibited in our culture, which then in turn drives employee performance. So there's a good reason why we're focused at the top. We're focused on those leaders, CEOs and general counsels, and then also the managers on the ground that are managing employees to help us navigate all of these changes that are happening in the workplace. Let's talk a little bit about inclusive leadership. And one of the things that we know is that leaders in the age of COVID can create welcoming workplaces and can create welcoming cultures by engaging in a set of proactive behaviors that really leverage the unique attributes of every employee that's coming into the workplace. And we call that inclusive leadership. And why is that important? It's important because leaders who master the art of enabling people with different perspectives and different viewpoints to work well together, particularly during a trying time like COVID and the racial strife that we're having, they're going to maximize the performance of their teams and their companies during this time. I want to talk a little bit about the impact of inclusive leadership on employees and on teams. I'm going to start with employees. This is research that comes to us from Russell Reynolds and Associates. They did a study back in 2018. It was really they conducted a comprehensive overview. They interviewed about 1,800 senior executives in companies all around the country. And here's what they found in their research, that inclusive leaders do significantly affect their employees' experiences at work. They can improve the outcomes such as job satisfaction, loyalty, and sense of belonging. And when employees have positive working relationships with their leaders, they actually feel like they can bring their authentic selves to work, and they actually feel like they can contribute at a higher level. So I want to take a look right now at some of the statistics, starting with going from my left to the right. We know that We know that when a leader is inclusive, Rebecca, one more. We know that when a leader is inclusive, 97% of employees have a positive relationship versus 54% when the leader is not. 93% of the employees are loyal and want to stay at a company versus 25% when there is not an inclusive leader. And 93% of employees say that they can be successful being who they are versus 30% when the leader does not act inclusively. So now
I was jumping the gun a little bit. Can you hear me, Michelle? No, oh, now you're muted.
Okay.
There we go.
Now?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay, technology, my goodness, my phone just decided to drop in the middle of the webinar. Sorry about that, guys. So let's talk about the impact of inclusive leadership on teams. We know that inclusive leaders also contribute to improved collaboration, and they are able to leverage the diverse contributions of each team member and empower groups to perform beyond the sum of their parts. And so we see a lot of similar positive impacts or effects on teams like we do on individuals. And so if you look at the graphic on the screen going from the left to the right again, 92% of teams say that they are empowered to perform at a high level versus 26% when a leader is not inclusive. 90% of teams say they produce innovative ideas versus 30% when you don't have an inclusive leader. 88% of teams report that they can effectively manage disruption versus 21%. And 90% of teams experience higher quality decision-making versus 24% when the leader is not acting inclusively. So I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca, who's going to talk a little bit about inclusive leadership, and we've developed what we call the 8 C's of inclusive leadership. And so I'll turn it over to you, Rebecca, so you can address those.
Thank you. First of all, can everybody hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, good. Thank you. So, the overarching goal for today is to try and create an ally culture, one of caring and compassion and concern. And as Michelle explained, the culture of your organization and your department comes from leadership. Leader drives these behaviors. So what does that look like in action? It's understanding and valuing the uniqueness of diverse individuals while also accepting them as an integral part of the team. You leverage the diversity of thought that comes with them so you can have a more productive and efficient work culture. And as Michelle said, we have identified 8 signature traits that we feel really encompass and show what inclusive leaders do, what their behaviors are on a day-to-day basis. And we did build upon Deloitte's 6 inclusive leadership traits that they had done several years ago on inclusive leadership. So the first is clarity. In times of crisis, our teams and individuals need clarity. They need to hear from us. Uncertain times create a need for reassurance and hope and direction. In order to provide this kind of clarity, it's really important to set expectations as a team. Together, start to discuss some of these core diversity and inclusion principles that should guide your team and what you should be focusing on. It should be also including self-awareness, appreciating differences, resisting bias and assumptions and stereotypes. And all leaders, especially senior leadership, can praise the value of inclusion and model these behaviors as well. If you're a diversity and inclusion leader in your company or firm, you can ensure that inclusive structures and policies are in place and are being followed, and people are being held accountable to these policies. Inclusive leaders also proactively create time and space for open and welcoming discussions around diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. They constantly seek input from backgrounds and perspectives. Next is cohesion. Now, we know that top leadership is essential in establishing a diverse and inclusive work environment, but it's not enough. Cohesion isn't accidental. It doesn't just happen. It is intentional. It's when leaders and individuals at every level in the organization understand the organization's core values and the importance of diversity and inclusion to their success, especially in a time of crisis and hardship. At its core, cohesion is about individuals working together, building on each other's ideas to produce something new. Inclusive leaders understand that for collaboration to be successful, individuals must first be willing to share their diverse perspectives by creating an environment where individuals feel that their diversity is valued. They encourage autonomy, empowering their teams to connect with others. They also understand that people are most collaborative when they feel safe in their environment to share their views without fear of embarrassment or judgment or retaliation. This type of environment really creates that healthy conflict that you need in order to produce and provide innovative solutions for your company. Finally, connection. Inclusive leaders have an open and curious mindset, right? They desire to understand and know how other people view and experience the world. They foster connection with others. They promote diversity of thought. They promote perspective taking and empathy. And by showing empathy, you are speaking to the human first. People need to be heard and seen. As leaders, we need to check in on them, ask them how they're doing, direct them to resources as needed. And we as leaders are uniquely situated to have a direct impact on how included members of our team feel. We do this every day with how we greet them, how we interact with them, how we assign work to them, who we give opportunities to. We need to acknowledge their fears and concerns in the workplace. Giving voice to our employees' emotional state especially increases their sense of psychological safety while making them feel valued and accepted. One way to provide a safe space is to begin each meeting or call with a genuine recognition and gratitude, thanking folks for their contributions, for their hard work, for big or small wins that they have received so far, and really talking about how they're feeling, how are they doing, what stress are they experiencing both personally and professionally, where there really are no longer clear lines between work and home life. Express your gratitude for flexibility, for their hard work. Ask your folks how you can support them. And encourage opportunities for virtual gatherings outside of the sphere of work. And a couple of examples that we have seen, which I thought were pretty innovative. Some firms now run joint video workout sessions, from yoga to meditation, boot camp, even I think one group was even doing like a virtual 5K, and it was just a really great way for people to continue to connect, to have a community, and do something together. Others schedule virtual happy hours or combined with a watch party. I think one really fun thing that we saw was a firm tax team organized a watch party of The Laundromat. That's a movie on Netflix with Meryl Streep, and it's very, very funny, by the way. And at the end, they discussed all of the different tax shore and offshore account company structures that were discussed and raised in the movie. Another one is Peloton Law Moms. I don't know if anybody is a member of that Facebook group, but they meet regularly to attend live Peloton biking classes via streaming video. They share teams with each other, they race each other, some even participate with their clients. The fourth C is communication. Communicate early and communicate often, and over and over and over again. I think it's said that you need to be able to communicate something in 17 different ways for it to actually be retained by the person. So it really needs to be varied and diverse and constant communication. But it also has to be with composure and compassion. Be real, be honest, share what you know and what you don't know. With bad news coming at a dizzying pace, it's tempting for some leaders to shield workers from maybe some negative developments going on, whether we need to extend furloughs for an additional month, or we are definitely going to have to start looking at budget cuts. And that may not be wise when it comes to keeping your workers' trust and respect. And this one is really, really important because there are definitely times when you don't want to share too many details because of liability or confidentiality reasons, but going radio silent isn't an option. A former firm I worked at was going through a very difficult time. We had lost several groups of attorneys back to back, and instead of acknowledging and addressing concerns and speaking to that elephant in the room, they clammed up. And over the next 10 months, we continued to hemorrhage attorneys and business and staff because there was no information coming from our leaders. Nobody was steering the ship. So people started making up their own story about what was going on in the firm. One person even told me that the only reason she was leaving was because everybody else was leaving. So there was nothing, no communication, no strategy. And it was really a difficult time for everybody involved, a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety. Needless to say, that firm dissolved and filed bankruptcy not soon after. But so that might be an extreme example of lack of communication, but it is a viable example of lack of communication. It's also important, really quick, to foster two-way communication and make sure that you are listening as well. During one-on-ones, I always ask my employees, how am I doing? Am I doing enough to support you? Am I giving you what you need? Is there anything that I could be doing differently or better? That makes them feel like they definitely have a say, that they can raise concerns and complaints in a safe space, and they feel more engaged to open up. So Michelle, I'm going to pass it on to you for the next one. And we can't hear you.
I was on mute, sorry. My goodness, technology. So courage, we want to make sure that we're asking our teams for grace. Let's face it, a lot of us during this COVID-19 have been making this up as we've gone because nobody has been through a pandemic before, right? And so, you know, we as leaders, though, need to ensure the continuity and sustainability of our organization as a whole. So we have to have responsibility for identifying what's important to people and what's urgent. And this is necessarily going to involve knowing when to delegate things, how to empower folks that are under us, and addressing, you know, what's urgent and what's important. The next one is confidence. We must also instill and project confidence in the face of obstacles. And we've got to remind people of their and the company's history of resilience. I think in times of crisis, it's really important to talk about your organization, talk about your culture, talk about times when you've overcome difficult situations. And I know, for instance, at Ogletree, you know, our founders like to say that, you know, they left a place that didn't give them a lot of input into decisions. They kind of call it, I think, at some point, a tyranny. So they left that environment and created a firm where they wanted greater transparency. They wanted to be able to share things more. And so as a result, we've been through a lot of things over the years since we were founded in 1977. And so it's been wonderful to hear those stories of resilience, which really does inspire confidence during a pandemic like this, because we know that this too shall pass. We shall get beyond this. It's just a matter of, you know, putting one foot in front of the other and our leaders being strong and leading us. So telling those stories and telling how the company has come through turmoil, I think, is a really good thing. Creativity is another thing on our list. Leaders really do have to know how to pivot. As we've seen in COVID-19, our priorities shift and change from day to day, sometimes, you know, hour to hour. It just kind of depends. And so we need to have the flexibility to be confident and agile enough to change our plans and then be able to communicate those changed plans to our employees. And a lot of that is just retooling sometimes the way we're going about doing things, whether that's with our clients, whether that's in the community, or whether that's with our employees. I know that a lot of our folks in some of our practice groups, particularly litigation, have not been super busy during COVID-19. So we've had to have them shift and pivot and kind of start to work on, developing themselves, whether that's engaging in doing more podcasts, whether that's writing blog articles, whether that is, writing white papers, whatever it is. But we've been asking them to kind of take on some of those continuing education opportunities, to take advantage of some of the e-learning modules that we have at the firm, to grow and to develop and take advantage of kind of that post-traumatic growth syndrome that I was talking about. And then commit, I think, is that our final C? Yeah, commitment is the final one. And this is really important. I think that organizations have to be committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have to ask ourselves, what is our own worldview and what's the cultural lens with which we are seeing the world, especially during stressful times like this where we're seeing a lot of civil unrest. We're having to still navigate this global health pandemic. And I think it's really important that the more leaders understand themselves, they'll be able to greater empathize with their team members, and they'll also be able to understand how bias impacts them as well as team members. And so I think, you have to be mindful as a leader to avoid bias like affinity bias, which is that tendency to like people who remind us of ourselves. I know I have to watch that in the recruiting process, because if somebody went to Tulane Law School, I love them, because they went to the same law school. I'm assuming they had a similar experience. I loved, my second and third year of law school, not my first year so much. But that affinity bias can kick in. Halo and horn bias, assuming just because somebody has done something really great that nothing else that they do, everything else that they do will be great and they can do no wrong. Or if somebody has made a mistake, assuming that that mistake is indicative of their work from that point forward and they can do no right. And so being careful of that halo and horn bias and confirmation bias as well. We've seen that play out in the work allocation process and in the recruiting and hiring process as well. So I think just taking personal ownership of those biases, how they show up for you as a leader, because in order to be able to effectively manage other people, we've got to take a look inward, and we have to understand what our own emotional reaction is to things and then reflect on our own ability to adapt to the circumstances and understand what our workers are facing and not let those biases get in the way. So again, just taking that time to look at your own worldview and question, why are you responding in the way that you're responding to a particular situation. And I'll give an example. I mean, a lot of us have Zoom fatigue. A lot of us do not want to be on these Zoom calls. But sometimes, depending on the culture that people come from, whether it's a collectivist culture or one that's more of an individual culture, it may be sometimes that, you're working with people who are extroverts. You're working with people who come from collectivist cultures and who want to see people, who want to be connected to others. And the way to do that is through a Zoom call or a Skype call, and taking those kinds of DE&I issues into account when you're thinking about leading your teams and communicating with your teams are really, really important. The other thing I want to just talk about a little bit before we get into the 3 A's is just that transparency around information, because we know that, information is key in law firms. And so you want to make sure that, it used to be that when we were in the office all the time, you'd walk by somebody's office, you could share information kind of casually and informally in the workplace. That's not happening as much now because we are still remote. And so making sure that you're not excluding people from diverse backgrounds, particularly who may not be as visible during the pandemic that we're in. So keeping team members copied on emails, inviting them to participate as passive listeners in opportunities such as virtual depositions, virtual mediations, virtual arbitrations, which we're having to do a lot of that at Ogletree now. And then also managing the workflow, making sure that unconscious bias isn't creeping in there, because we know that that happens a lot of times in the assignment process, where we may go to somebody over and over and over again. And so we don't want that to happen. We need to maybe have pictures of everybody on your team who could be available to work on a particular assignment, and think about, how do you vary who gets to work on what? Look at all the realm, the entire realm of possibility of who is available to work on something before you just automatically say, okay, I'm going to go back to Rebecca because Rebecca did this project for me great last time, and I know she's going to do a good job. She'll be timely, and let me just do that. So really expanding your repertoire and thinking beyond that. So let's now, we talked about the 8 C's of inclusive leadership. I want to now talk about the 3 A's of allyship and navigating racial strife, or navigating a racial pandemic, which is what we are in the middle of. So I'm going to turn it back over to Rebecca, who's going to address those 3 A's, which are acknowledge, affirm.
And yes, Michelle, I always do an awesome and amazing job, so thank you for letting everybody know that. And again, I do want to acknowledge that we are coming at you during a very scary and unprecedented time. And not only are we struggling to recover from a health crisis, now we are experiencing civil unrest and racial strife all over the country. And this is causing trauma on everybody, especially the people of color that you work with. And that trauma is coming in the door with them, or it is coming in the remote virtual door with them as soon as they turn on their computer. That doesn't go away. So we really need to make sure that we take these things into account when we are working with our people, when we are talking to our people, because we can no longer live in a world where we leave home at home and we don't bring in the personal, because these traumas, these things, the stress impacts our ability to engage effectively in our work. We cannot ignore these current events and the current situations. So a couple of things that that we do want to talk about. So we have the 3 A's, and the first is acknowledge, and this really is just paying attention. Do the research to fully understand the events. Racism and other forms of oppression are everywhere, even if you don't experience them personally. So paying close attention to what's being said, what isn't being said. When you're in a meeting or a conversation, as Michelle said, take a look. Who is in this conversation? Who isn't in this conversation that should be? Taking a very critical eye at that and actually actively managing that. And like I said, do the research. Go beyond, your high school friends' social media posts that, kind of talk about all these different conspiracy theories. Acknowledge the pain and suffering that your diverse coworkers are enduring right now. One of the things that I do as an ally, or I try to do as an ally, is when I do see some of those really hurtful or inaccurate statements, posts, memes on social media, I don't just scroll by. I engage in a very respectful way, but I make sure that I say, hey, no, that's not okay. That's not right. Here is what that really means. So that is one way that you can show just anybody that you interact with that you do see that and you do have the tools and the willingness to jump in and mitigate that. It takes a lot, especially for you just to name what happened, and you need to let your team know that you're paying attention. I want to acknowledge what's going on. I want to talk about this. I want to hear how you are doing. My door is wide open. Whenever you feel comfortable, I will listen to you. And I know that there are some who may be concerned about ruffling feathers. They don't want to offend anyone. Oh God, do I really want to bring this up in the workplace? This could bring up a whole can of worms. You need to look in the mirror and ask yourself, am I okay with my team thinking that I don't care? Or worse, that I'm actually condoning what is going on? Because that's the message that you are sending when you don't address and when you don't have these conversations. It's also important to extend grace to people. Your people are going to make mistakes. They're going to say the wrong thing at the wrong time. Give them grace. They're learning. They're being vulnerable, and they're showing up to this conversation. Help them, and don't judge them, because then they won't want to start having these conversations anymore, and then we'll get nowhere. And also, acknowledge your privilege. A critical part of being an ally especially is recognizing the benefits and power you have because of the identity that you were born with. At the same time, recognizing the disadvantages and attacks that other people experience because of the identity they were born with. Affirm. Creates a safe space for employees to share. Many people of color are looking to their leaders to affirm their right to safety in the workplace. It's incumbent on us as leaders to listen to people who are marginalized when they speak about their feelings, their emotions, and how things are impacting them. We need to hear them, and we don't necessarily need to respond, but we need to validate their truth and say, oh, wow, I am really sorry. Tell me more. How can I support you during this time? But also understanding that you need to know when to talk less. Now, even though you're in a leader, this isn't about you. This isn't your story. This isn't your truth. You need to give your employees and people of color that work with you the space to share without feeling like you need to comment on everything, to prove what an ally you are, to prove how aware you are or woke you are. Amplify their voices. Let them speak. Let them have the spotlight for a change, and really, really validate them. Being proactive with checking in with your team, letting them know you care. Present yourself as a resource in case your team needs that extra support. You could do this by, at a group check-in, start the meeting with let's go around and do a really quick check-in on how everybody is feeling today. Give me one emotion that you're feeling and ways that the rest of us can support you. Leveraging your one-on-ones is another really great way, especially doing more of a deeper check-in. Like I had mentioned earlier, what am I doing to help you? Am I providing you enough support? How are you doing really? How are you taking care of yourself during this time? Some of your team members may seem distant and disengaged for a while. It's important to recognize this as a valid self-care mechanism. Respect their boundaries, ask what support looks like for them, and then back away. Caring for people a lot of times does look like staying away, giving them the space and the boundaries that they need. And then also making sure that you're hosting a forum for these safe conversations. One of the things that we are doing at our firm is we are hosting weekly open forum town halls. We send out some sort of resource the week before, whether it's a TED Talk or an article, and we use that as a jumping off point to have an open conversation with everybody in the firm who wants to join in on the call. And we break down into breakout rooms via Zoom to have even smaller group discussions about some of the deeper issues that are going on. It is very cathartic, and we have had so much appreciation shown to us for actually having a space for people to talk. It's been really, really a wonderful experience for everybody. And then finally, ACT. One of the big things with ACT is reducing the emotional labor and emotional burden that some of your employees may be going through. Following a traumatic political event or a racial event, consider reducing the team's labor, their actual labor, their workload, and or their emotional burden. And if you have the flexibility, you can allow folks to take a little bit of time off to go home and self-care. You can ask your team how you can shift priorities, work deadlines for them. For example, you could say, let's revisit what we're doing this week. What do we absolutely have to get done this week? What can we put off until next week when we may be more effective and in a better mindset? And as a leader, you need to be prepared to take on some additional emotional burden. So your team members who represent these marginalized communities don't have to step in and educate others on what is going on.
Michelle, you're muted.
All right. I don't know what's happening with the technology today, but she is signing back in. So I will go ahead and take over where she was, just so we can keep it moving. I think that she had left off in terms of stand in solidarity. And that is one of the things that as allies, we want folks to be able to stand strong with us and to know that we are undergoing tremendous amounts of stress and anxiety navigating this COVID-19, the global pandemic, and then also navigating the racial strife that we are experiencing. So just to know that we have people standing in solidarity with us, expressing their empathy, expressing their concern, being willing to just, speak out when necessary, when they see something, to say something, that is showing solidarity. Are you back, Rebecca?
I'm back. I think my phone just did the same thing. It just completely hung
out. Yeah.
The last part of the ACT piece is avoiding missteps. And we are going to be making mistakes. We are going to step in it sometimes. And that's okay, as long as we can recognize it, admit it, and move forward and do better next time. Some of you may have seen this graphic kind of circulating on social media recently. I think the first version I saw of it was about, how are you going to act and behave, and what mindset are you going to be in during the pandemic? Are you going to be the one that, hoards all the toilet paper? Or are you going to be the one who's like, you know what, we will get through this, and there's definitely enough to share. This is really a journey. Allyship is a journey. It's a process. You can either be in the fear zone, which is that fixed mindset where you avoid having these conversations. You want to be comfortable. Moving over into the learning zone where you start to recognize that racism really is a problem, and then you seek to be more uncomfortable and intentional with learning and educating yourself. And then finally, in that growth zone, in that growth mindset, you are able to fully acknowledge the privilege that you have and how you benefit from a systemic racist system. You educate others, and you're much more of an accomplice or an advocate, speaking out more publicly about these issues. So really need to look at what are some of the things that I can do to help move myself, move my team, move my organization from the fear zone over into the growth zone. And the first misstep that can block you from moving along, that can actually make you take a few steps back. The first one is keeping silent. White people don't like to talk about race. I think that that's definitely something that we've all experienced, especially when, their own beliefs, their own perspectives, even their privilege has been challenged. This is really, really difficult conversation for people who have benefited and have had privileges bestowed upon them. They don't want to admit that those things that they have worked hard for are unearned. They don't want to admit that they might be a part of the problem. So, keeping silent when you see something, keeping silent when you're in a meeting and you hear a man interrupt a woman and start to mansplain. Keeping silent is perpetuating the problem. You need to be able to speak up. You need to know how to speak up. Becoming overly defensive. This is well, no, I didn't mean it that way. That wasn't my intention. It's not about intention. It's about impact. Understanding what you're saying has ripple effects, and it does impact somebody else's emotional, psychological, and mental well-being. So becoming overly defensive when you make missteps, when you say the wrong thing, which is going to happen, really makes people, targeted communities, feel more alienated, because then they feel like we're gaslighting them. And that's not a productive and healthy way to encourage conversation. And then also overgeneralizing, taking one attribute of a group and trying to sweeping generalization over all of them, assuming that all people of color believe this, that all white people believe this. Really take the time to talk to other people and look at, okay, what are your specific, unique thoughts and feelings and respecting towards this? Don't just assume that they feel a certain way because of how they look and what group that they belong to.
Okay, I want to talk a little bit about some of the companies that have gotten it right in the last few weeks, since we've seen a lot of this civil unrest in our country. Best Buy senior leadership team, I think, offered one of the first corporate statements acknowledging the death of George Floyd and the harassment of Christian Cooper in Central Park in New York City, as well as the jogger, Ahmaud Arbery. And so what they said here, I just took a clip of it to put it here on the screen. We write about these events not because most of us know what this fear must be like. We are, as a group, by and large, not people of color. We write this not because most of us have known anyone personally in a situation like this, but thankfully most of us do not. We write this because it could have been any one of our friends and colleagues at Best Buy or in our personal lives, lying on the ground, struggling to breathe, or filming someone as they threatened us. So I think that was just such a powerful statement. We also had Citigroup CEO Mike Corbat, who acknowledged that many of the his employees, have experienced racism in their everyday lives in overt and subtle ways. And he says here, I want you to know that your colleagues and I will always stand with you. While I can try to empathize with what it must be like to be a Black person in America, I have not walked in your shoes. And so I thought that was pretty powerful as well. And then next, Ben & Jerry's statement has also made the rounds on social media. A lot of folks have been looking at that, and it was a pretty extended letter that they sent out where, silence is not an option. We've got to dismantle white supremacy. I want to read you just a couple of lines from that, just because I think it's profound. All of us at Ben & Jerry's are outraged about the murder of another Black person by Minneapolis police officers last week and the continued violent response by police against protesters. We have to speak out. We have to stand together with victims of murder, marginalization, and repression because of their skin color, and with those who seek justice through protests across the country. We have to say his name. And then they go on to explain who was George Floyd and that he was a brother and a father and a friend, and they talk a lot about that. Then they go on to say Floyd is the latest in a long list of names that stretches back to that time and to that shore. Some of those names we know: Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Oscar Grant, Eric Garner, Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Emmett Till, Martin Luther King Jr., most we don't. They then go on to say, 4 years ago, we publicly stated our support for Black Lives Matter movement. Today, we want to be even more clear about the urgent need to take concrete steps to dismantle white supremacy in all of its forms. And to do that, we are calling on 4 things. And then they go on and list out what are those 4 ways to be involved, everything from legislation to creating a bipartisan national task force to some of the criminal justice reform in the Department of Justice. I think that, those are very concrete examples of how leaders have stepped forward in a time of racial strife and racial turmoil and civil unrest in our country, and been unequivocal in their rejection of hate, their rejection of injustice, their rejection of racism. And I think we should call upon our leaders in our own companies and in our own law firms and law schools and to do the same, because we have to stand in solidarity with those who are marginalized, with those who are experiencing these injustices. At the same time, though, we also have to lead by example and take care of ourselves. So we cannot forget about ourselves. It's common for leaders to take care of everybody else except for themselves, but we've got to make sure that we are taking care of ourselves and that we're paying attention to our own emotional state, we're getting the resources where we need them, and that we don't skimp on the things that really help us both personally and professionally, because I will tell you, this work is draining. Rebecca and I and Kelly, the other manager on our team, we've been working 15, 16, 17-hour days, and there is no way, first of all, that's not sustainable. We know that. But second of all, it definitely is not sustainable if we're not taking care of ourselves. And so things like coaching, having our own coaches, things like therapy, taking advantage of the EAP process within your own company through HR, mindfulness practices. We have every Wednesday, in fact, we missed it today, but every Wednesday at 1:30 Central Time, we have a Mindful Wednesday for 30 minutes where we have one of the shareholders in our Los Angeles office who we call our mindfulness guru, because she is into wellness and meditation and yoga and those types of things. And so she leads anybody who wants to join this Zoom call, whether you're attorney, staff, leadership, C-suite, board, what have you, in a mindfulness session where we are meditating. And she will also talk to us about the values of making room for this in our lives. And so I look forward to every Wednesday, because it's an opportunity for me to level set. It's an opportunity for me to come back and come back to myself and recognize that I've got to de-stress. I've got to get rid of some of my anxiety, or I'm not going to be good for the people in my organization. And we do all of these things because we can't be successful leaders and managers if we're not doing it. I do want to go over just a couple of ways that, you know, if you're a manager in your law firm or your company, your law school, or, you know, you're a leader, a C-suite, some of the things that you can do to feel supported is, one, you might want to consider forming some kind of informal group of socially conscious leaders where you can meet regularly to talk about bias in the workplace and harm in the workplace that's happening. You can share ideas about creating an inclusive team culture. You can lean on each other for support during challenging times. I know that we have that within our team, you know, my diversity and inclusion team. We also have created at Ogletree an equal justice task force, and, you know, we've come together, group of people all across the firm to talk about what we can do to improve racial injustice in America, not just in our law firm. We have these open forums that Rebecca talked about. We also are putting together town halls because now what we're finding is that people in individual offices, people in individual practice groups also want to have a safe space for their leaders to come together and kind of have these conversations. So forming that informal group if it doesn't exist in your organization, and then also seeking support from external groups, getting a network together for people who can get together externally. I had that through a small group of chief diversity officers in an organization that Corey Carew and I are part of. Rebecca's part of it. It's called the Association of Law Firm Diversity Professionals, ALFDP, and we brainstorm with each other. We share best practices. We talk about how we're navigating the civil unrest, how we're navigating COVID-19, and it has just been a phenomenal external group of a support network for all of us, and we've really enjoyed that. So I would encourage you to create that internal group, to create that external group if you don't already have it. And so with that, I know we have about 9 minutes left. I want to open it up so that we can take any questions that you might have and spend the last few minutes just kind of answering those questions. I see in one of them through the chat, I know Corey's going to, Corey, if you see anything else, let us know, but there's one question about, can you expand on the halo and horn bias? And sure, I can expand on that. For the halo bias, it seems like, you know, somebody, let's just say you're in a law firm and you have an associate. Hello?
Michelle, I can hear you. Rebecca, I lost you both and you're back now.
Okay, I'm back. Sorry about that. I don't know why this is happening. This has never happened to us on a webinar before, but halo and horn bias, let's say you have an associate who, let's say went to Harvard Law School. And so the halo bias comes in because that person went to Harvard. You assume that they're smart, you assume that they're bright, you assume that they have the analytical skills that you need, the writing skills. And so even if they make a mistake, even if, you know, something happens, you're going to kind of gloss over that, and you're not going to really look at it as carefully as you would someone who went to Mizzou, or, you know, Mizzou meaning University of Missouri, or a local or a regional school. And so that's the halo concept. And the horn concept is just the opposite of that, you know, assuming that if somebody makes a mistake, and let's say they went to a lesser school, a perceived lesser school, you know, they went to a University of Missouri, Kansas City, oh my gosh, well, everything that they do is not going to be as good as the person who went to Harvard. And so that follows that person throughout, right? So whatever writing assignment they turn in or whatever, there's just this assumption that it's not going to be as good. And that kind of plays into confirmation bias as well. Rebecca, you want to add anything to that?
No, I think that was really good. And I think too, as leaders, it's not, just important to create these diverse groups, but you really need to make sure that you are looking at the biases that come across in the process. You know, for example, people who, you know, think alike, people who have kind of that affinity bias for each other tend to group together, especially when it comes to brainstorming or trying to solve problems. You know, people who have that in-group, out-group, they tend to cluster. So they only kind of stay over here with these people. Confirmation bias comes in when, you know, people, okay, I need to research this. This is a great resource that just so happens to confirm my own worldview. So this is the resource that I'm going to use to verify what I already believe. So these kinds of biases come up not even just in your interactions with people, but in the processes you do as you go through your work.
Yeah, and I would encourage anybody who's interested in exploring their biases more to take the implicit association test. You know, Google Project Implicit. They have tests for everything from, you know, differently able disability to weight to skin color, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity. And so you can take these tests and you can measure your level of bias. And so that really is the first step in interrupting your bias, is to become aware of what your bias is so that you can, in fact, then interrupt it. So any other questions, Corey, that you're seeing? I'm not seeing any others in the chat right now. And I don't know, Corey may have had to drop off. So I don't think, I don't think that there are any other questions unless anybody else sees anything. No? All right, well, I am going to conclude our webinar today, and I want to thank you all for joining us today in spite of the technological difficulties and challenges that we've had. It's been a bear, but that's okay. We made it through. And
it throws you off your game.
I know, it throws you off your game a little bit, but I think we've done a good job of showing resilience, Rebecca, and kind of jumping right back in and, you know, just keep going. So thank you all. Again, this has been part of the Belonging Project, which is a wonderful collaborative initiative that Saifar Shah has put together with other national affinity bar associations, legal organizations, legal departments, law firms, and we are so privileged to be part of this. And this is the first webinar that Rebecca and I have participated in with the Belonging Project, and we're very happy to have done this today. So thank you, Corey, for having us, and thank you to the Belonging Project for the wonderful work that you all are continuing to do to make sure that that recession that happened in 2008, 2009 does not negatively or disproportionately impact our diverse law students and lawyers going forward. So thank you. Rebecca, any parting words?
No, just again, thank you. Spread the word about the Belonging Project. This is a wonderful initiative. We want to make sure that people know that it's a resource, know that it's here. And it's not just webinars, it's also coaching and mentoring and actual physical resources for attorneys and law students and legal professionals to use to get through this. So definitely check it out, spread the word. And if you have any suggestions or thoughts on other things that we can do, whether that's topics for webinars, additional resources, don't hesitate to reach out to Corey, and she will make sure that it's definitely taken a look at.
Thank you. All right. Have a great day, everybody.